I found this article today, and I thought it was really interesting. This is a great intersection between research astronomy and physics education, and I love this kind of stuff. So, the article reads, "Want to watch the sun safely with a large group? Get a disco ball." And at first you might be like, wow, this is very different than I normally go over on this website, because like I said, normally there's papers attached to everything that this website does. But fun fact, there actually is a paper associated with this, with the best title ever, Why Every Observatory Needs a Disco Ball. So I'm just going to jump straight into the paper. The article basically just summarizes what the paper says without too much additional information. So I'm just going to jump right into the paper. So, why do Robert J. Cumming and the rest of them say that every observatory needs a disco ball? Well, it's actually kind of interesting. The idea behind it is that a disco ball acts surprisingly like a pinhole camera. I'm sure most of you can pretty much work out what a pinhole camera is. It is a camera that's made with a pinhole. So you basically take a box and you put a pinhole in it, and that's your pinhole camera. You might have also heard it as a camera obscura. It's the same concept. And a lot of people know that this exists, but not too many people are able to explain how it works. So I figured I would take a little time to talk about pinhole cameras as a concept, and then we'll go into why the disco ball is so useful. If we have a pinhole camera and the hole is sufficiently large compared to the source, you're going to get what you would expect to get. You're going to have just a straight beam come through, and you're going to have the image on the other side. This is effectively every window. You have the outside shining in, and you just get a big block of light on the back, right? That's just how an opening works. But as you close that opening, you start to get a different effect. This effect is called diffraction, and the reason this happens is because light acts like a wave in some circumstances. So as the light comes in through this tiny little pinhole, some of it will continue straight and you'll get a big bump in the center, but then it'll start to cancel itself out towards these edges, and you'll get these dips in intensity followed by a small bump in intensity. I'm not going to go over diffraction principles right now, you're just going to have to trust me on that front. If we are looking at both of these effects, what we end up getting is a pinhole that creates a diffraction effect as well as allows some of the light through directly. This is near field diffraction and far field diffraction, as well as the geometrical optics approach. Long story short, if you have a pinhole, you're going to get both of these effects, which will create an enlarged image of whatever this pinhole is looking at. The size of the pinhole matters a lot, and we'll take a look at that in a second. There's actually a great Khan Academy web applet that I'm going to show you. This is a thing that we see every day, and you might not have noticed it before. I'm sure everybody has probably seen this effect, where you can see the sun image through leaves. So you have a tree, and you can see all of these individual sunspots. I don't mean spots on the sun, I mean individual spots that are the sun. This is effectively just a bunch of pinhole cameras. As the leaves in the tree are realigning, sometimes you'll have two leaves that cover each other just like this, and you get a little pinhole in the center. That pinhole then creates an image of the sun that's enlarged on the ground. So you're effectively seeing multiple copies of the sun through these pinhole cameras. The cool thing about this is, and I actually am going to switch the order that I originally wanted to do this in, let's say that the sun is not fully visible. Something like, an annular eclipse or a partial solar eclipse like is going to happen on, I think it's April 4th of this coming spring. Don't quote me on that. It's somewhere in that range. Well, you get an image of what the sun looks like through the pinhole. You get these little crescents. This is one way you can observe a solar eclipse, is just through the trees. And here's another great example of an annular, or at least a nearly annular solar eclipse through some tree leaves. It's very, very cool. So how does this work? How does this concept function? This applet does a really good job. I would expand it, but the applet doesn't like it. It doesn't scale very well. So how does this work? Well, if you have a pinhole, and I'm going with a pretty large pinhole right now, the way that it works to produce an image on this backdrop is that every point on the original object will have some amount of rays that can get through this pinhole. This is just picking a point at random and shooting out a ray somewhere within a 180-degree cone, or I guess a 180-degree swath. It's not really a cone. Maybe it's picking this point right here, and it's producing a random ray that's within the 180 degrees from this line up and down the tree in the direction of that pinhole. And then it's saying, okay, of those rays, how many make it past the object and through the pinhole? That's all it's doing. And if we do that for long enough, we get an image on the other side. Now, mind you, this image sucks. You can tell that this is actually something, right? But you can't really tell what it is. And as this aperture would increase, we would effectively get closer and closer to this big block of light that we would normally see through something like a window, because every single point of this tree image can effectively touch almost every point on that backdrop. It actually does the reverse too. So like up here, we can see almost the entire tree. Down here, we can see the entire tree, and down here, we can see still almost the entire tree. So every point, if we were to consider this a bunch of pixels, would be seeing most of the tree. If we grab an image, well, we just get a big splotch of light. If we were to turn the light down, we would see something start to appear, but still not great. But what happens when we lower the aperture? So let's lower the aperture about that much. If we lower the aperture about this much, and I'm just going to clear the 2D image for now, and we start to look at what happens, well, say this bottom portion of the tree, right? Whereas before this was covering like most of that back screen, when we reduce the size of the aperture, we're covering a significantly smaller portion of the screen. So what would be the bottom of this tree is appearing on only this portion of the screen. All of the rays it can produce will only end up from about here upwards. So that tree trunk effectively is only going to show up on this portion of the screen. And the top of the tree will do the exact opposite. The actual leaves of the tree start appearing around here-ish. We're still getting some mixing with the trunk, but that's okay for now. And as we get down here, we're only getting the top of the tree. But if we capture a 2D image, we can start to see some actual structure here, right? We can see the trunk of the tree, and we can see the sort of shape of the top of the tree. And as we go to the limit and we make this aperture as small as possible, if we pick a point somewhere on the tree, there's a very, very small amount of places where that light can end up. Effectively, we're scanning just that part of the tree onto this backdrop. So here we get absolutely nothing. Down here we start to get the trunk. Then over here we start to get the leaves. And then we lose it again. So if we grab a 2D image like this, we get a very, very dim image because most of the light isn't making it through, but we get a very clear image. And as we increase the amount of light, we get a brighter image. Now, mind you, this is perfect. We're dealing with an infinitely small aperture in this case. More realistically, we could expect an aperture of about maybe this size, which is going to give us an image, but it'll be slightly blurry as we start to actually reduce the amount of light that comes through, which is part of the action of the pinhole camera. We start to get another image, but it's blurry. And again, that's because these different portions of light that are coming through are spread out. This isn't a perfect point-to-point source. This bottom part of the trunk can end up anywhere in that little splotch over here, this area-ish. And then we have portions of the screen that can see both, which is where we're starting to get that mixing. So picking your aperture size matters a lot. If you want to get a really bright image, then you're going to have to worry about the size of your aperture, and you're going to have to worry about this blurriness. But if you can capture a very dim image, say you have a long exposure camera, you can get away with something like this and get a very good image out of it. It all depends on your setup. So with all of that in mind, why do they want to use a disco ball? Well, it turns out that all a disco ball is it is a bunch of tiny little pinhole mirrors. They're all a bunch of squares, and none of those individual square mirrors should be aligned with each other, which means that as the light comes in, it'll hit one of these squares. Some ray from the sun will hit one of these squares, but not the other, get reflected, and then go to a point somewhere on the wall. And this is a great example of it. This is quite literally a disco ball projecting a solar eclipse. We can see it very clearly right here in the bottom right. This is an expanded version of one of those images on the wall, and you can actually see the action on the wall too. And all that is the light coming in, hitting one of these little squares and having the same pinhole effect, whereas this one is dealing with the screen on the other side. Effectively, the same idea can be thought of as if this was offset a little bit, coming over to this pinhole and then reflecting in the other direction. So instead of this ray from the tree trunk going to this point and then passing through, it's going to this point and bouncing off. And we're getting a resulting image on the wall. And as this thing gets further and further away and becomes more offset, which is effectively the result of having a whole bunch of mirrors that are all offset. Of course, there's going to be one that's head on, but all the rest of them are around this globe. We can have these offset images that all show us the same thing. They give us a pinhole camera effect that gives us a, well, not enlarged, it is small, but it gives us a focused image of what we're looking at, which we normally can't see with our eyes. Fortunately, it gets dimmed a lot, again by this action. Even if we have a bunch of light, the resulting image is still way dimmer than the original object, which is what we need to observe the sun safely. It also brings up an interesting point. If you have a back mirror, or a back-coated mirror, I should say, you get this cool effect where you get ghosting. So this is a disco ball that has the front surface is glass and the back surface is the mirror, and this bottom image is a front mirror surface. You get this ghosting effect because the glass actually reflects some of the light itself. So you get one image, and then you get the back reflected image, and then you get another image that's the light that came in, bounced off of the mirror, then bounced off the glass, and then bounced off the mirror again. And every time you do this, you lose some light. So this ghosted image on the right is significantly dimmer than this ghosted image on the left, and you can actually use this to work backwards to figure out the reflectivity of the glass itself, which is pretty cool. It's a neat little experiment that if I ever end up teaching optics again, I might use, because I actually really like it. This also brings up a good point. This is also why science mirrors for things like, major telescopes are front-coated, not back-coated, so you don't get this ghosting effect. Here's another great example of what this can be used for. This is imaging things in front of the sun. So this is sunlight blocked by some tree leaves, and it's being not magnified but focused by this disco ball. It's really, really, really cool. They do it again down here. This is really, really cool because disco balls are cheap, like really cheap. Last thing, you can also use this to observe sunspots. So, for those who don't know, sunspots it's a difference in solar activity compared to the rest of the surface of the sun, usually caused by magnetic fields. And it turns out, if we look really closely, you can actually see the sunspots, at least the largest ones. You can see the largest sunspots. Let me try to get them both in view. Yep, so right here and right here, you can see the sunspots on this reflected image. It's not easy. They make a point to mention that you need to be in a very dark room for this to work, but you can see sunspots from the sun using this method. This is a really cool, easy, simple, low-cost method to do solar observing in a classroom. This is incredible, and if I ever teach in a classroom setting again, you better believe I'm going to get myself a disco ball and we're going to be funky out here. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to share.